Alright everyone, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into this and hope my camera is actually recording me as I'm speaking. So welcome again to week 3 of our World Civilizations 2 class. You should be on topic 2 for this week. So if you have not already watched topic 1, I would recommend you go ahead and do so. In the meantime, we're going to be looking at some of the more well-known areas of Asia today and look at some of the Chinese and Japanese dynasties from roughly 1500 to 1800. So now again, I'll mention this just one more time. Probably done for the last time though, let's be real. This is one of the problems with survey courses. We do have a lot to go through, a lot of time, and a very short amount of time to do it. So I do recommend all of you, if you find anything particularly interesting in any of these lectures, please consider taking more specific history classes on them later, wherever it is you end up. These survey courses really can't do it justice. In the meantime, key terms we're going to look at today. We're going to talk about isolationism, which as you'll hopefully see, was a common trait on China and Japan during this time period. We'll look at the Ming China society, the Qing dynasty, the Tokugawa dynasty in Japan, and the 47 Ronin, which some of you might be familiar with that Keanu Reeves movie. Took me a while to say it for some reason, from a few years ago. If any of you have seen it, please let me know how it is. I've thought about watching it for a while. In the meantime, I'll just go over these very quickly since I mentioned them last time. Please keep in mind your first content quiz is coming up probably very soon by the time you're by the time you're watching this. So make sure you get that turned in on time. I am giving you an extra day because of the Labor Day week. Please take advantage of that. Also, final essay thesis statement coming up on the 18th. I went over a lot of detail in the last lecture about how that assignment is going to work. Please make sure you view that if you haven't done so already. Also, writing assignment 2 coming up on the 25th. Please again check your previous PowerPoints or go over the prompt and rubric. Preferably do both to get ready for that assignment if you have not already done so. If you have any questions about any of these assignments, please let me know as soon as you can. In the meantime, let's review a little bit and look ahead. Imaginary audience that actually isn't here right now. What did the Mughal Empire teach us about the benefits and drawbacks of trying to assimilate or fuse many cultures into one nation? I'll give you a moment to think at home. It's really my only option at this point. So yeah, as you probably remember from last time, one of the benefits is that it can theoretically create more unity and allow for a new complex culture to form when you try to assimilate and fuse different religious or ethnic groups. However, it can lead to further conflict as well. So trying to fuse these two cultures like the Mughal Empire did, or fuse multiple cultures, has its benefits but also has its drawbacks. This time we're going to look at sort of an opposite approach from China and Japan. During this time period, like I mentioned, China and Japan both largely became isolationist. For those of you who maybe are especially familiar with America's behavior in the world wars early on, what does isolationism mean? Again, pause for the audience. Give you no longer pause. I'm probably moving through this a little bit too quickly. Yeah, as this one's probably pretty self-explanatory. It's simply when a country or a nation tries to tend to just its own affairs and essentially ignore what's going on in the rest of the world and try to prevent foreign influence from coming into the country. Now, what role might this relationship with the rest of the world play in this process? I worded that horribly. What role might their relationship with the rest of the world essentially play in this process? What do you think maybe made them become isolationist? Alright, and maybe in order to explain that question or to give you help with that question, think about what happens to China and Japan as history progresses. Any thoughts on that? Imaginary class? Oh, well, you're not imaginary, you're just not here right now. But yeah, essentially, as we're going to talk about, a lot of the argument for why this occurred, we'll talk about some of the internal reasons, but it's also largely due to European influence. Much of Asia resisted, of course, being colonized, and isolationism is one way they did that. Now, a couple of important terms we're going to look at that will come up, especially when we talk about China, but also Japan, are the ideas of the inner and outer domains. The inner and outer domains essentially is how China and Japan saw the world. They were the inner domain, or the light of civilization, wonderful place to live, pretty much how every culture sees themselves at one point or another, at least in their history. And the outer domain is everyone else. Why are these terms maybe significant in how these civilizations view themselves, and how are they going to affect China and Japan? Again, awkward pause for people who aren't here. Yeah, as you might also imagine, a lot of it is again to justify this isolationism, or a result of it at the very least. If you consider yourself superior to the rest of the world, you might want to cut yourself off from the world and avoid the outside world from contaminating you. So it's again, it justifies this imperialism. If you keep to yourself, it's because you believe you have a superior culture that must be protected. We'll look at how these ideas played out in both China and Japan as we speak. So, first off, for looking at China, couple of major characteristics of the growth of China right before this period, and some of the resulting consequences. First off, the China we're going to be looking at today had a great period of growth. Couple of reasons. Actually, ironically, is because of depopulation. The Black Death, bandits, and war were a very big problem, of course, throughout the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries in China, much like the rest of the world. Why could that actually be a good thing for China? Awkward pause again. Yes, as you might imagine, the Black Death with depopulation, there's more available for everyone else. So actually, the population that was left got access to more land, more food and resources, because there was less competition. So this actually allowed Chinese populations that were left to get healthier and to grow. Also, the Columbian Exchange was going on during this time, for those of you who are familiar with some of the other things we've talked about, which is hopefully all of you. European traders actually brought corn, sugarcane, indigo, and tobacco from Africa and the Americas to China. This, of course, gave them new food resources as well as new crops to grow to trade, which again increased their ability to access new resources. So all these things occurring around the same time actually helped to benefit Chinese growth. Because of this, there was a big population boom. Between 1368, which is the start of the Ming Dynasty we're getting ready to look at just for a little bit, to 1600, China's population more than doubled, and by 1800 it had doubled again to roughly a total of 300 million. Now, this is going to look a little bit ahead to Chinese history after today's class. How might this end up being a problem? Alright, as many of you are probably thinking, it's essentially leading back to this depopulation cycle. Once your population starts to grow, if you're not able to handle the growth and have enough resources for everyone, the population is going to go back down because of scarcity. Few ways we can fix this. We'll talk about some of them. Technological innovation might be one. Thanos, what he did, might be another. This is essentially the Thanos argument. If you can't stop this overpopulation, everyone goes hungry. We'll talk a little, obviously, as those of you who are familiar with contemporary Chinese society, we're going to talk quite a bit about how China deals with this over the years. In the meantime, let's go ahead and look at Ming China specifically. Ming China was a society that lasted roughly from 1368 to 1644. Couple of important things about them, starting with their economic policy. China, the Ming Dynasty, was very dependent upon mercantilism. For those of you who aren't sure what that is, make sure you review some of the past lectures. Mercantilism has been a big part of what we've discussed so far in the growth of international relations and trade. One particular thing to notice about them is that they had a strict policy of controlling and regulating all imports and exports into their territory. Why do you think that is? Again, awkward pause for this audience. Well, for those of you who are familiar with mercantilism, you would understand, of course, that controlling your imports and exports is a big part of mercantilism. You want to control all of the trade going on in your territory because if you do, you're obviously going to get a slice of it. Whether through taxes, direct trading, however it is, you get at least some of the money. Trade growth led to an international demand for China's porcelain, tea, silk, and cotton. This, of course, benefits the country because, again, if you know what mercantilism is, you would be aware about how important revenue growth is for the growth of a country, according to the beliefs of mercantilism. So the whole region is starting to become more prosperous. Ming China is also significant for something called a single whip tax system they came up with. For this, and for those of you who remember, this is very similar to what the Mughal Empire did. They would look at land holdings and value them on an individual basis, and then give them a tax plan that they had to pay in silver throughout the year. Why is this maybe going to be a benefit? And to maybe help with that question a little bit, think about what would be different if they demanded the same taxes from everybody all at once. Awkward pause again. But yeah, for those of you who understand sort of how people react to taxes, which is many of you, Americans love to talk about taxes. This is, of course, going to be much beneficial, arguably, to the Chinese economy and really to their morale. Because for one, you're not going to have people go broke when they try to pay their taxes all at once. And it also is going to probably appease the various poor people all across China because they're allowed to pay their silver throughout the year whenever they can get their money instead of being required to pay it all at once. So this is, again, a pretty progressive tax system, you could argue, that benefited Ming China for quite some time. Ming China is also credited for popularizing the Outer Realm and Neo-Confucianism ideas. This was essentially led to their Outer Realm, and Inner Realm theories. The Mings in China believed that China had been placed at the center of the world. Everything else revolved around them. This essentially dictated every aspect of the rest of their society. For example, it controlled their international relations. They placed very strict restrictions on their sea trade and diplomacy, and only really conducted diplomacy in commercial terms. What exactly does that mean in simple terms, and why did they do it? All right, as you could probably guess by looking, again, referring to the isolationism we've been talking about, this essentially means that instead of having any foreign influence on their country, they're only going to conduct business with people. So again, this shows their devotion to mercantilism and making money. They're only concerned in growing their economy, and theoretically, it's also going to prevent other countries from having an influence on them since they're only conducting negotiations based on trade. They don't care about anything else. As a result of this, they were powerful enough to where emissaries from Korea, Vietnam, and Japan would come to Ming China to appease the emperor in order to be given permission to trade in China. So not only was this trade restricted, it was so lucrative, and they had so much power in the negotiations that people had to come pay respects to the emperor, even though the only thing they were allowed to negotiate on was the economy. So again, very isolationist, but very profitable at the time. However, once the Manchus arrived, there was a big downfall across the Ming Dynasty. Few major problems they had. One, there were rebellions in the north and the western sections of the Ming Dynasty. This was, again, as you might have guessed, this was largely as a result of the strict regulations they had upon trade. While it was profitable, it did irritate some people on the exterior of the empire because they weren't really able to benefit from this trade very much. Also, as we'll talk about a little bit more detail when we get to Japan specifically, there was a war going on with the Japanese leader Hideyoshi in Korea from 1592 to 1598. Why exactly do you think they would bother fighting in Korea? Take a moment to think. Especially for those of you who are familiar with imperialism, that's a key characteristic of imperialism. You spread across the world to get new territories, to gain access to new resources and labor. So this demonstrates that both Japan and China were attempting to spread at this time. More specifically, the biggest main problem they had was the rise of the Manchus. The Manchus were an Altaic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, speaking people. This is essentially a language family for the Turkish, Mongolian, Japanese, and Korean languages today, which were originally a group of ethnic nomads who came from the northeast section up here of Ming territory. Rebels against the Ming sought the Manchus as allies, so these other rebellions started to join them, and by 1642, the Ming dynasty had actually been weakened to such a point that they actually were invited across the Great Wall into the very heart of China. By 1644, the Manchus had supplanted the Qing dynasty, and or supplanted the Ming Dynasty, my apologies, and founded the Qing Dynasty, or as we call it, or as it's translated, the Pure Dynasty. Again, the Manchus have come in, essentially taking over at this point. Now, one issue that the Qing Dynasty had to deal with that's very similar to the Manchus is something called minority rule, which is something they really had to deal with all the way from 1644 to 1912. Throughout their reign, as you could probably guess, the Manchus were a minority ethnic group in China. The minorities, the groups that they had now supplanted and were ruling, actually outnumbered them. So, of course, why is it going to be difficult to be in this position, especially if you're a new imperial dynasty? As I wait for an imaginary response. But yeah, as something that we still deal with today to a certain extent, if people try to control, if a minority group tries to control everyone else, a lot of times that can lead to conflict because these minorities or these other groups outnumber you. So again, very difficult to try to impose your will on them. Some possible solutions we talked about with the Mughal Empire are, of course, the synthesism. You can try to synthesize your cultures and try to appease as many people as possible. Of course, this could theoretically lead to more unity, as I keep saying, but it could lead to further conflict. We'll talk about that, of course, as we continue in the context of China. A couple of ways they tried to pull this off. One, as you might imagine, the Qing Dynasty actually tried to do a mix of adapting other cultures while also doing forced assimilation. For example, they were actually pretty lenient in terms of government positions. They would recruit ethnic Chinese and ethnic Manchus to government jobs in equal numbers. So they tried to actually have equal representation in government. However, one interesting part of their culture is that they actually forced all males in China by law to adopt the Manchu Q hairstyle, or you would literally be killed in response if you did not. This actually was such a bitter law that it led to revolts all across the Qing Empire. Why do you think that's probably the case? Again, pause for the audience that's not actually here. Alright, this shows the importance of how passionate people are to their cultural practices, and again, one of the negatives of trying to have a minority rule and force different cultures together. If you're too aggressive with it and try to negate someone else's culture especially, that tends to lead to conflict. So again, it shows the difficulties of this minority rule. By the 1720s, China actually sought to bring the remnants of the Mongol Empire, what was left of it, into their imperial system. Why do you think they would do this? And if it makes it easier, think about why the Mughal Empire that we talked about last time, why they tried to claim descendants from the Mongol Empire. Now, those of you who remember from last time, the Mughal Empire wanted to claim descendants from the Mongols to legitimize their rule. We have connections to these past great rulers. We deserve to rule now. China essentially wanted to do the same thing. If we can control this great empire and bring it into ours, it makes us look more impressive and powerful, plus we access everything they have. Works for everyone, essentially. In 1727, they actually established a proctorate in Tibet with the Dalai Lama as the political and spiritual leader. So this is actually when the Dalai Lama, for those of you who are familiar with him, got its start. One of the greatest emperors and most legendary emperors in all of China in this dynasty was Hong Li, or as he's called, the Qianlong Emperor. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not. He is credited, since he ruled from 1736 to 1795, as one of the longest ruling leaders in world history. One of the reasons for this is that even after he retired, he was known as the retired emperor and still ruled essentially in all but name until his death in 1799. Obviously, he ruled for a very long time. He's going to be a very significant leader. Few military successes. He led successful campaigns across modern-day Taiwan, Vietnam, Nepal, and Burma. So he's a very successful military leader, obviously. Also, he had some sort of diverse cultural impacts. On the one hand, he ordered the compilation of Manchu histories, genealogies, and rituals. Why do you think he would do that? All right, and again, if it makes it easier, think about what the Mughals did, the Mughals did when they tried to connect their histories to the Mongols, and why we even, for example, try to preserve our history as a nation, and why that's so important to so many people. Awkward pause again. Hello, camera. Right. As you might imagine, and for those of you who are familiar with typically how governments try to legitimize their rule, if he's able to compile all these histories and genealogies, it gives people a history to look back on and essentially justifies their rule now in China. Because the farther back you can trace it, you can tell people, oh, look, we've been in China for this so much longer of a time. We've done so many great things. We deserve to be in charge. On the other hand, he also ordered massive book burnings. He's credited as having ordered the burning of roughly 2,300 works that were anti-king or focused on the frontier too much and not on, again, the inner domain. Because obviously, as you might imagine, this is, again, a part of his cultural control. You want to collect and praise everything that celebrates your dynasty, and you want to get rid of everything that could suggest that you aren't legitimate rulers or you aren't the historical rulers of China. Now, looking into European connections for just a bit, China also had to deal with European connections, obviously, which again contributes to their isolationism. For example, 1557, Portugal established a colony in Macau, China. Again, might not be pronouncing that correctly. The Chinese reaction, of course, is to get very upset and lead to some of these other practices we're going to look at right now. One, for example, Chinese mission. As soon as this colony was established, Catholic missionaries quickly started coming into China. Well, two of the most important and influential were the Franciscan and Dominican orders, who had, due to their limited knowledge of the Chinese language and culture, as you might imagine, had what kind of impact? Again, waiting for the audience to answer. Please answer at home. I would love it. But yeah, as you might imagine, they were not very successful because obviously that cultural divide is going to be huge. No real way to communicate and share ideas. The Jesuits, initially led by Matteo Ricci from 1552 to 1610, were much more successful. He actively encouraged the adaptation of Chinese culture and for them to share science, mathematics, and technology ideas. However, this actually angered the papacy. Why do you think that might be? All right, for those of you especially who remember last time, for example, it's very similar to how some Muslims in the Mughal Empire reacted when certain leaders tried to bring in more Hindu ideas. A lot of times people who are very passionate about their religion, which again is not a problem on its own, hesitate to bring in other ideas from other cultures and other religions. This can upset them greatly and make them aggressive. The Jesuits, many of the other Jesuits and the people in the papacy did not like this change. This, of course, led to the Jesuits losing some influence and eventually got to the point where missionary activity was totally banned in China by 1724 due to all these different orders trying to gain influence in China. Eventually, the trade in the entire in all of China during this dynasty was limited to something called the Canton trade and with the East India Company. The East India Company established a trading post in Calcutta in 1690. However, the dynasty eventually limited trade to just one single harbor at what Europeans translated to Canton. Foreign traders at the time, as you can see a little bit in this picture right here, were confined to small factory compounds and not allowed in the city to bring their families while they traded. Why do you think that is? Awkward pause. All right. As you might imagine, it's relating again to that desire for isolationism. It's much harder for you to influence the culture of a new country if you have to stay on the harbor at the whole time, and you can't bring in your family. Without a family, many people aren't going to be willing to really set up roots in a new country, so you don't have to worry about families settling in and spreading their influence across the country. Again, they're controlling all aspects of the trade. They can only trade on Chinese terms and can't influence anything. Obviously, Europeans are not going to like these restrictions, which is going to lead to some later conflicts we'll talk about throughout the semester. Now that China has been wrapped up for the most part, keep that in mind though, China is obviously going to be relevant as the semester continues. We'll look a little bit at what Japan was going on, specifically some of their more ancient discord and reunification issues. One of the biggest issues in Japanese political history actually started all the way back in 1185. This was when the office of the shogun was created in the Japanese court. The shogun was the chief military office of the entire realm. Essentially, it would be the equivalent, in our terms, of the Secretary of Defense in America. One of the reasons this was such a problem is that very quickly the emperor became just a puppet ruler by the shogun in the 13th century. How do you think that happened? Alright, as you might imagine, it's actually another example of some of the problems with delegating power we've talked about in previous civilizations. When you delegate too much power, especially to someone who has all the military power, they're going to probably tend to abuse that power. So essentially, these shoguns, as we're going to see throughout Japanese history, would use their military power to use the emperor as a puppet ruler. Since they would claim they had the representative of the gods on their side, like many other governments have done that we have talked about and will talk about, it would justify their military rule. So this, obviously, as I mentioned, this shogun problem is going to continue throughout a huge portion of Japanese history. For example, in 1333, Shogun Ashikaga, I'm not going to even try to disrespectfully pronounce that, expelled the emperor and started a civil war. This lasted for almost 100 years, and by 1467, another civil war had broke out as a rival daimyo, which is essentially a regional warlord in Japan, began to fight over the title of shogun. This civil war lasted until the 1570s, so again, this one's all over 100 years, and ultimately destroyed the Japanese capital of Kyoto. So, as I mentioned, this again shows the problem, some of the potential problems, especially in an imperial system, of delegating power. If you delegate too much power, your military leaders, especially in this case, are going to abuse that power and fight over control of the entire empire. So again, like I said, this shogun empire is not shogun problem is not going away anytime soon. For instance, the reunification is credited in Japan as having started with this gentleman right here, Oda Nobunaga, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Toyotomi. I'm not even trying to pronounce that, be disrespectful, but his last name is Hideyoshi. I can't pronounce that. Odo was a daimyo in Japan from 1534 to 1582. He is called the Great Unifier in Japanese traditional history because he started a war to unite all of their samurai in Japan in the 1560s. He again shows the importance of European influence, like some of the Mughal leaders we talked about last time, by using European muskets and various other technologies to secure Kyoto. He was very successful militarily until he was assassinated in 1582. His son, Hideyoshi, lived from 1537 to 1590, or was in power from 1537 to roughly 1598, and he was, of course, like I said, the son of Nobunaga. I probably pronounced that wrong as well. By 1586, he declared that he was going to now conquer all of China. Why do you think he would make such a statement like that? Well, as many of you would probably respond, the obvious answer is that maybe he actually wanted to. If he conquers all of China, he has access to all these people and to all these resources. However, if you look at some of his military campaigns and successes later, and some of the other great military leaders we've talked about, such as Hongli, military success is often very inspiring to people, and it helps to unify people in a common cause. This was essentially continuing his father's legacy to try to unify all of Japan. For example, as I already mentioned, from 1592 to 1596, he tried to conquer Korea. However, unfortunately for him, in 1598, he died during his second invasion of Korea, which, as you might imagine, caused the daimyos to turn on each other once again, led to further conflict. So, based on this, what seems to be the main problem with unifying Japan? Okay, as you probably noticed, the main problem, as I basically already gave away, is often connected to the shogun office and how much these power these daimyos have, as they try to fight over this title. So essentially, imperial delegation has not gone very well for them. Instead of unifying Japan, it's just caused different military warlords to fight over this military title. So essentially, the disunity among the daimos fighting over the shogun title is the main hindrance to a unified Japan at this time. However, Japan was essentially unified for a time, at least, by the Tokugawa Bakufu. I might have actually pronounced that correctly. I deserve a cookie. In 1603, Tokugawa, I'm not going to try to pronounce that, led all of the western daimyo to victory against the east and was established as the new shogun. So again, like I said, this title was founded almost 500 years before this took place, but it had created such disunity in China that it continued all the way to this point. He was eventually made the shogunate, the position, hereditary. Why do you think he's going to do that? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Hopefully viewers at home. Now, as you might imagine, it probably leads to a couple of benefits. One for him and his family, arguably, but arguably also for China. One, it increases his family's personal power, obviously, as well. It would ensure that the shogun, the most powerful position in all of Japan at this point, is going to continuously stay in his family. However, it could theoretically end these issues that these great founders and early Japanese samurai and daimyos had to deal with. Instead of people fighting over the shogun position all the time, it has a steady line of succession. They also came up with the tent government system. This is essentially also known as the rule of alternate attendance. This is actually, for those of you who are familiar with Game of Thrones, which I'm assuming, given the way the world works, is most of you, at least until the last season, which I was also disappointed by, for those of you who were. But back on topic, what this system meant was that defeated daimyos had to alternate on a yearly basis, living in Tokyo, or the capital at the time, and living at home. So essentially they would stay in the emperor's household for a year, or the shogun's household for a year, and then spend a year at home. All the members of their family would also stay as permanent hostages. Again, just like the Game of Thrones scenario, this is intended to keep these rebellious daimyos in line. You're much less able to fight when you have to constantly travel between your home and staying right under the emperor's nose, and you're of course even less likely to fight when members of your family are in constant danger if you do so. However, this system has also been credited with leading to the growth of the Japanese economy, because since these wealthy and powerful families were constantly traveling back and forth in Japan, it boosted an entire commerce and service industry. Because, for example, think about where all the greatest hotels and service industries are in our world today, or in America. They're in tourist spots where a lot of travel happens. So all this increased travel actually benefited the economy because various industries had to pop up to deal with and cater to all this travel. Also, Japanese Neo-Confucianism popped up, so again, this inner and outer realm issue. The Japanese declared that all of Japan, under the Tokugawa, would stay in their current social classes forever, including their descendants. So essentially, they're going to stay in their social class, and so will their descendants. The samurai and daimyo positions are now all hereditary elite positions as well. What kind of effects do you think this might have on Japanese society? Now, as you might imagine, naturally, this is going to, one, again, make things theoretically more stable at first because you don't have to fight over these various positions, but it is going to lead to a very inflexible social structure in Japan and irritate some of the lower classes of society, which we will... excuse me. I've had to record. Excuse me. I swear I don't have any sickness. I've had to record so many of these today. Please bear with me. Now, in the meantime, Tokugawa isolationism was also, as obviously, a major issue, like we've already looked at with Japan. One of the main issues they had was trying to weed out any foreign influence, because obviously they would view any foreign influence as a threat upon their power. One of the ways they actually accomplished this was in giving up the gun. This was essentially a term given to the practice where the Tokugawa police confiscated and destroyed almost every firearm in Japan. This actually was such an extensive practice that when the Japanese, when Europeans and Americans started to militarily confront Japan on a larger scale, many of them were actually attacking with guns from museums that had been made way back in the 15 and 1600s. Now, why would they want to do this, do you think? Again, awkward pause for the recording. Yeah, as you might imagine, on the one hand, it of course makes rebellion much harder. Because remember, one of the most successful daimos was successful because of his use of European technology. This prevents that, and also makes the samurai and daimyo positions more prestigious, because sword culture is now what's practiced all across China. So it makes these daimos and samurai look more powerful, because they're of course going to be the best at it and the most elite. Also, with this expansion and influence, the Japanese also had to deal with the Christian problem as well. By the 1600s, the Tokugawa had already begun expelling European missionaries. The English and the Spanish were both gone throughout the 1620s. Portugal was gone by 1639, and the Dutch were confined to a small island in Nagasaki by the 1600s as well. It actually got to the point where by 1635, all Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the island. So their desire for control was so extensive that they basically outlawed all travel completely. By 1637, Christians and other dissatisfied samurai actually led a rebellion. They were defeated, as you might expect, and the survivors were either roasted to death or offered the opportunity to trample the crucifix. This is literally just where they would trample on crucifix as a sign of the renouncement of their faith. So again, this is just some examples of how extensive the Tokugawa isolationism was and how much they desired control. Moving into the economy a little bit, Tokugawa Japan is actually notable as being the most urbanized pre-industrial society in the world. It is estimated that the city of Edo, for example, had a population of roughly 1 million people. This, of course, encouraged, again, kind of like the Tokugawa travel, all sorts of commercial and service industries across Japan. You had bathhouses, sake brewing, artisans, and academics all across the country. They were also notable for their efficient and small-scale intensive rice and vegetable farming, and for their tax system. So again, like some of the Chinese system, the Ming system before them, and the Mughal system, instead of having a flat tax rate, each village was given their own rice quota, which they transported to the capital. So again, instead of being taxed equally across the board, no matter your wealth, they were given their own quotas to meet. This again also spurred more commercial trade, because you had all these tributes being constantly shifted to the capital. You had all sorts of trade and industries set up to help this trade out. Lastly, but definitely not least, we're going to look at the art and culture of Tokugawa Japan, which is actually some of the culture of Japan you're probably the most familiar with. One of the big important legacies from Japan is bunraku, which is Japanese puppet theater. One of the most famous, or arguably the most famous of this puppet theater, is the 47 Ronin, which again, maybe some of you have seen the Keanu Reeves movie. If you have, let me know how it was. This was actually based off of a 1703 incident in which the daimyo of 47 samurai, so essentially a governor who had 47 samurai working for him, was killed. Then the samurai avenged his death, and as you can see over here, immediately committed ritualistic suicide afterwards. As I'll show you again in the next slide, for some of your assignments coming up, keep in mind, why would this be such a popular play in Tokugawa Japan? Why would you want to share this depressing story of a humongous mass suicide? The famous haiku, which you've all learned about in English classes, I'm assuming at some point, was credited as being started by someone named Matsu Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694, which is a famous form of poetry which compresses emotion and then releases it in poetry. Essentially, and I'm far from an English expert, keep that in mind, but it was such a popular form of poetry in Japan because it was considered a very subdued emotional expression. Instead of being very heart on your sleeve and very expressive, it was a very short poem, obviously, that had to be very subdued and get its message out very quickly. This was very popular in Japan since you had this, again, samurai society that doesn't want to show weakness or too much emotion. The Tokugawa Japan Society was also known for coming up with the ukiyo-e, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, or pictures of the floating world, which is a form of woodblock printing that became popular at the time. The most famous artist of this practice was Kitagawa Utamaro, who lived from 1753 to 1806. He particularly did art studies on women, which I just put in parentheses because it sounds kind of weird, but it's what he did. And it's what is credited with establishing the Japanese perception and standards for female beauty for essentially until the present day, most likely. For example, for any of you who have gone to a Japanese restaurant at some point or any Japanese site, you've probably seen this two consorts picture, which is very common and very popular. So that's just a little bit about their culture as well. Finally, I won't make you watch this today because I've already taken up enough of your time, I'm sure, but make sure you look at the true story of the 47 Ronin, and again, analyze some of the purpose of this story, how it affected Japan, and what its impact was on the samurai class as a whole. In the meantime, of course, keep these thoughts in mind as well. Again, why did they all built these cultures seek isolationism? What were some of the impacts? And for the future, consider what impacts this might have on the outside world. Lastly, just of course remember some of your assignments that are coming up. Any questions about those, please let me know as soon as possible. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week, and let me know if you have any major questions. Thank you.